So if we have a look now at chapter 4 that deals with the elements of our financial statements, we know that we have 5 elements. And these 5 elements will be assets, liabilities, equity, and these 3 items will all be disclosed on the statement of financial position. Then we have expenses as well as income. And these items will be disclosed in our statement of profit or loss. So let's take a closer look at what the definitions of these items are. So an asset is a present economic resource controlled by the entity as a result of past events. Now, if we take a closer look at economic resource, this is a right that has the potential to produce economic benefits. And what is meant by right? The conceptual framework has a number of examples illustrating what constitutes a right, but we're going to only address 3 of these. Namely, the first one is a right that is obtained from owning or leasing a physical object, the right to receive cash, and the right to exchange economic resources. Then when it comes to the entity having control, again, there are a couple of scenarios that exist that illustrate that an entity has control. But if we have a look at a few examples, the one would be the direct use of economic resources and where the entity obtains economic benefits that may flow from it. The entity has the power to prevent other parties from directing the use of the economic resource, and the entity also has the ability to enforce legal rights. So these are all examples of where the entity has control. Now let's go have a look at an example. Here we have Grace Limited, which is a clothing store that specializes in men's clothing. And on the 1st of March 2019, Grace Limited purchased a warehouse of 2.3 million rand. The warehouse was purchased to eliminate the shortage of storage facilities and increase sales by ensuring there was sufficient stock on hand for items that are high in demand. Now, the required states that you need to discuss whether or not the warehouse meets the definition of an asset in terms of the conceptual framework. And you are told to ignore the recognition criteria because we have not dealt with recognition yet. Now, very important, this is a theory question. And when you deal with theory questions, the very first thing you need to do is identify the theory that is needed and start your solution off with the definition or the theory that applies. The second part will be to actually apply this definition or the theory that is applicable to the information in the question. And lastly, very important, you need to conclude. What is your conclusion regarding everything that you've already addressed? So if we have a look at the solution, firstly, we need to identify the theory needed and we need to start with the definition. Now, the required states that we need to discuss whether or not a warehouse is an asset. So therefore, we need to refer to the definition of an asset in the conceptual framework. Now, an asset is defined as a present economic resource. Now remember, an economic resource is a right that has a potential to produce economic benefits. And this is controlled by the entity as a result of past events. If we apply the definition to the information in the question, we start with what is a right? Because the first part of our definition says a present economic resource. Now we know that a present economic resource is a right that has a potential to produce economic benefits. So we're first going to break that part up and deal with what is a right. Now, a right is where we have an economic resource that has the potential to produce economic benefits. So now we know that Grace Limited has purchased the warehouse, and therefore, because they have purchased this warehouse, they have a right to use the warehouse. Remember, we said one of the things that is a right would be ownership of a physical object. The next thing is the potential to produce economic benefits. Now, does this warehouse have the potential to produce economic benefits? Well, the warehouse will enable Grace Limited to store clothing and therefore could produce economic benefits. The reason being, the clothing sold to customers will result in cash inflows, and therefore the potential to produce economic benefits exists because this warehouse is going to store clothing and ensure that Grace Limited has enough stock to sell to their customers. The next part of our definition is controlled by the entity. So, is this warehouse controlled by Grace Limited? In this case, Grace Limited has purchased the warehouse and therefore they do have the control over the right associated with ownership. So, Grace Limited has the ability to direct the use of the warehouse and they can prevent other parties from using the warehouse. Therefore, Grace Limited has control over the right. The last part of our definition is a past event. Now, a past event means that it's already occurred, and in this case, we do have a past event because a past event is the purchase of the warehouse. Therefore, a past event has occurred and has resulted in Grace Limited gaining control over a present economic resource. So now we need to conclude. And our conclusion is that the warehouse complies with the definition of an asset in terms of the conceptual framework because we've addressed each one of the points of our definition and all four of those points have been met, and therefore this is an asset in terms of the definition of an asset.